Welcome once again to Official Topic Talk. Please subscribe, like and ring the notification bell, because every time I go live you'll get a notification and I'll get a view. Well, this morning it's come to my attention within the news. Inquiry video reveals true horror of child exploitation in Telford. I'm going to play you a short video in a couple of moments, but I'd just like to point out the man who led the inquiry into Telford's child sexual exploitation scandal has released a damning video telling how generations of children were failed by the authorities. Now, I've covered this over numerous videos within my channel, going back to as far as 2018, where the authorities failed the victims because they were too scared to be called racists. Now, 12 years or so later, the truth is actually now coming out that the police failed these victims. Social services failed these victims, and also teachers in the local schools have failed these victims. It just goes to show you the extent of police corruption within the UK. They're getting paid to do a job, and 12 or 14 years later you realise that that job was never done. And it's the reason why child exploitation in Telford is so high, because these perpetrators just carried on abusing our children because the authorities wouldn't do nothing about it. Tom CROWTHER QC, who led the independent inquiry into Telford TSE, spoke after the report was published and explained how victims were blamed for their abuse and were shared and trafficked. The inquiry chairman said the abuse went back into the 1970s, and only the nature of gifts offered by groomers changed, from sweets in the 1970s to mobile phones and top-ups 30 years later. In a video outlining his findings, he said, "For decades, CSE thrived in Telford unchecked. The account of a child in the 1970s who recalls being sexually touched by groups of men in the corner shop and given gifts for her silence echoes in similar accounts given by victims 30 years later. Only the nature of the gifts had changed. No longer sweets, but mobile phones and top-ups. I saw a reference to exploitation having become generational, having come to be regarded as normal by the perpetrators and as inevitably by the victims and survivors, some whose parents have been through similar experiences." The inquiry chairman speaks of a nervousness from police and council workers that investigating concerns against Southern Asian men were inflame racial tensions. He also added that there was an official response. It was often unhelpful and the approach misguided. He also outlines how just when Operation Chalice had successfully jailed 7 men involved in a Wellington grooming gang, the council and police efforts to tackle CSE regressed. He said following the conclusion of the Operation Chalice trials, the council and the police were slow to recognise the importance of a properly funded CSE response. Indeed, by 2015, both the Council and the police provision for CSE had in some ways gone back almost a decade. Ground level officers and practitioners who were keeping the CSE response alive. He added, "It is proper that I record there were very useful developments in 2015/16 in both the Council and West Mercia Police response. These were driven through, it seems to me, by the combination of external reviews of those organisations and once more because of the continued efforts of part of a few individuals." I'm now going to play to you the video which reveals the true horror of the exploitation in Telford.
Today sees the publication of the report of the Independent Inquiry into Telford Child Sexual Exploitation, or CSE. It's 3 years since I was appointed to chair the inquiry. Completion of the inquiry and the publication of this report has taken longer than I, or the commissioning body, expected. And while I regret that this report has taken longer than I intended to publish, I'd hoped that it would be out soon. I don't consider that it could, in all the circumstances, have been different, for two main reasons. First, because the inquiry's scope has been very wide. In terms of analysing the response to CSE in Telford and drawing conclusions, I've looked as far back as 1989. However, I made clear from the outset that I would hear from victims and survivors of CSE, regardless of when they were exploited. That decision has been vindicated by the witness accounts I've seen from victims and survivors who were exploited as long ago as the 1970s. Second, we've received a greater volume of documents than we expected, and we've had to review large quantities of material to identify and analyse what's relevant. The inquiry's received in total over 1.25 million pages of material. Additionally, we've taken and considered evidence from 170 witnesses, on some occasions seeing witnesses more than once, during a time when the COVID pandemic has made meetings much more difficult. The pandemic, of course, also impacted the speed at which disclosure has been provided by key organisations, many of whom have been at the forefront of the local COVID response. Furthermore, we've continued to receive acutely relevant material from key stakeholders, particularly Telford and Wrekin Council, even during the last few months. The overwhelming theme of the evidence has been the appalling suffering of generations of children caused by the utter cruelty of those who committed child sexual exploitation. Victims and survivors repeatedly told the inquiry how, when they were children, adult men worked to gain their trust before ruthlessly betraying that trust, treating them as sexual objects or commodities. Countless children were sexually assaulted and raped. They were deliberately humiliated and degraded. They were shared and trafficked. They were subjected to violence and their families were threatened. They lived in fear. Their lives were forever changed. They've asked over the years, how was this allowed to happen? In brief, I found the following. More than 1,000 Telford children were exploited over decades. Obvious child sexual exploitation was ignored. Information was not properly shared between agencies. Key agencies dismissed child exploitation as child prostitution. Key agencies blamed children, not perpetrators, for exploitation. Exploitation was not investigated because of nervousness about race. Teachers and youth workers were discouraged from reporting child sexual exploitation, and as a result, offenders were emboldened and exploitation continued for years without a concerted response. The CSE response, when it came from committed individuals not from top-down directives. And even after Operation Chalice, the Telford CSE prosecutions, West Mercia Police and the Council scaled down their specialist CSE teams to virtual zero in order to save money. The purpose of this inquiry is to give voice to the victims and survivors, to try and provide them with answers, and to identify learning points for key stakeholders in the future. Giving some more detail to the headlines I've set out, my report will show. First, for decades, CSE thrived in Telford, unchecked. The account of a child in the 70s who recalls being sexually touched by groups of men in a corner shop and given gifts for her silence echoes in similar accounts given by victims and survivors who were exploited as children 30 years later. Only the nature of the gifts had changed. No longer sweets, but mobile phones and top-ups. I saw references to exploitation having become generational, having come to be regarded as normal by perpetrators and as inevitable by victims and survivors, some of whose parents had been through similar experiences. Attitudes like that can only develop if exploitation is not properly recognised and challenged. And in my view, for many years in Telford, as in many other towns and cities in England, it was not. CSE in Telford was not hidden, and key agencies were aware of it in detail. There's evidence that in the 1990s, people working with children, police officers, youth workers, teachers, expressed their concern about repeated episodes of children going missing and numerous cases of adult men exploiting children. The local press reported public concerns about child prostitution. The evidence shows, though, that these concerns and reports were largely not taken sufficiently seriously by the council, by its predecessor authority, or by West Mercia Police. Failure by these agencies to investigate emboldened offenders. Failure to safeguard children properly put children at risk. So far as both the council and West Mercia Police were concerned, a number of features appear to have contributed to this shocking failure to address CSE. A focus on abuse within the family at the expense of extrafamilial exploitation. Over-caution about acting in the absence of, quote, hard evidence, that is a formal complaint from a child about exploitation. And a nervousness that investigating concerns against Southern Asian men in particular would inflame racial tensions. In those cases where there was an official response, the response was often unhelpful and the approach misguided. Throughout the early 1990s and 2000s, exploited children were seen by professionals within safeguarding and within West Mercia Police as having made unwise, quote, lifestyle choices. The children were treated as having put themselves at risk, rather than having been intentionally targeted for exploitation. For far too long, there was no CSE-specific response, and the focus of all participating agencies was upon changing children's behaviour, rather than seeking to understand the reasons behind that behaviour and targeting criminal perpetrators. Although things began to change in the mid-2000s, with the creation of the Council's Children Abused Through Exploitation, or CATE team, and the beginnings of West Mercia Police's Operation Chalice investigation, these positive developments were not the result of any political or high-level organisational response within the Council or West Mercia Police. Rather, they resulted from the determination and drive of a few individual professionals. These were small teams, inadequately funded, and while they cooperated extensively with each other, for years there was no real integration between the CATE team and the Council's safeguarding operation. This was in no real sense an overarching multi-agency response. Following the conclusion of the Chalice trials, the Council and the police were slow to recognise the importance of the retention of a properly funded CSE response. Indeed, by 2015, both the Council and police provision for CSE had in some ways gone back almost a decade. It was, as it had been in 2006, ground-level officers and practitioners who were keeping the CSE-specific response alive. It's proper that I record that there were very useful developments in 2015-16 in both the Council and West Mercia police responses. These were driven, though, it seems to me, by the combination of external reviews of those organisations and, once more, because of continued efforts on the part of a few individuals. The Council made the Cape team a properly established and funded part of its safeguarding response, and West Mercia Police formed a specialist CSE team, crucially with analytical capability. And there have followed a number of increasingly positive reports and reviews of both the Council's and the police's CSE provision. I do consider that today the key organisations responsible for addressing CSE in Telford, that is the Council and the police, have in place properly resourced, dedicated and expert teams that are well equipped both to identify CSE risk areas and to help children who are being exploited. But in my judgment, key organisations should reflect upon why it took them so long to react when the lives of children, and consequently, of course, the lives of the adults they would become, were being blighted by exploitation. The inquiry's terms of reference require me to consider the extent of CSE within Telford, to make some assessment of how many children were exploited over the period of my terms of reference, that is, since 1989. As I've said, I'm satisfied on the evidence that CSE has existed in Telford for decades. The town's history of child sexual exploitation became the focus of national press attention in 2016, when journalists of the Mirror Group, notably Geraldine McKelvey, spent months working with victims and survivors of CSE. And in 2018, as a result of this work, the Sunday Mirror suggested that, quote, up to 1,000 girls may have been subjected to sexual exploitation in Telford over 4 decades. The extent to which that estimate was accurate has been the subject of debate in Telford. For my part, I've considered a great deal of material in the course of this inquiry in an effort to make my own assessment of the prevalence of CSE over the years. I include the witness evidence and a great deal of data from a number of sources. And I've come to the conclusion that the Sunday Mirror's estimate is an entirely measured, reasonable and non-sensational assessment. Inquiries like this, at their best, drive change, but they can only do so if the organisations and agencies that are subject to criticism accept the spirit in which those comments are made and review the findings I've made in a way that's reflective and self-critical. Neither reflexive denial, deflection of blame, or excessively optimistic statements would be a useful response. I consider it would be most helpful if key stakeholders commit to accepting the recommendations that I've made throughout my report, which are all designed to ensure that the progress which has been made is assured for current and future generations of Telford's children. My terms of reference require me to review stakeholders' progress against recommendations in 2 years' time, and I intend to publish that review. And it's important, therefore, that those stakeholders accept that they will be held accountable to the victims, survivors, and public at large for their response to my recommendations. Fundamentally, I consider the best defence against repetition of the failures of the past is for the wider public to understand the awful nature of CSE, to be vigilant in seeking to expose it. That means children's voices must be widely heard, and the experiences of victims and survivors understood. In the course of this inquiry, I've spoken to victims and survivors of CSE, and I've read about the lives of many others. My view's been that it's an essential function of this inquiry that those accounts, whilst explicit and upsetting, are faithfully recorded. And in the report, the voices of those exploited children feature throughout, in case studies and in extracts from witness accounts and from documents. They've always been and remain at the heart of this inquiry, and I hope that this report goes some way to giving a voice to those children, now adults, who have, over the years, been ignored, marginalised, and even blamed for their own exploitation, and to providing them with some of the answers they've been seeking for so long. Thank you very much.
Now, the truth's actually coming out about how the authorities failed these individuals that were screaming out for help way back years and years and years ago. But it just goes to show you the extent of the problem. Now once again, I'll recap again. Deprived brothers led Telford paedophile ring that groomed and prostituted young girls. Following the publication of the Crowther report into child exploitation in Telford, Mark Andrews provides an insight into the background leading to the inquiry. I'm just gonna get up an article that will just recap on the offending behaviour of some of these perpetrators. Mohammed Ali Sultan admitted sex with a 13-year-old and another teenage girl, and controlling the third girl as a child prostitute. It has been branded as Britain's worst sex abuse scandal, with claims that up to 1,000 children could have been affected by these two individuals, and furthermore,